Hey friends. So I've been getting a lot of questions about the Clarity Catalyst and how that relates to relationships. And so I'm going to tell you a three-part story here. And I'm going to start with how I broke the cycle of some really unhealthy relationships that I had, and I found the one. So I want to take you back to, you know, let's say the late 70s, early 80s. And I didn't have a good example of marriage from my parents. They did their best, like, bless them, but they just both came from toxic homes, got married really young, and did not have a healthy marriage. And then in there, my dad was in an awful car accident when I was in second grade. He almost died. That created a lot of financial trauma and emotional trauma. And then when I was a senior in high school, my younger sister was hit by a car and nearly died, suffered a traumatic brain injury. I went off to college, and then my parents got divorced. And I mean, I was shattered. Like, I had no emotional resilience. I didn't know really how to go out into the world and be a grown up, and had some really unhealthy romantic relationships because of that. And there was one in particular that started with a friend I'd grown up with, and we started dating in our early 20s, and it was a really unhealthy relationship. We were together for about 10 years, and there was just back and forth. Like, we would break up, he would move out, he would apologize, say he would do better, move back in, and the cycle would continue. And this went on until we were about 30. And, in that relationship, again, everyone has their perspective, but this, from my perspective, like, there was emotional abuse. He was a gaslighter. I know that's a term that gets thrown around a lot these days, but it was the literal definition of gaslighting. And ironically, I had seen the movie Gaslight years before, and we were riding in the car one day, and I was like, what is that movie? And I couldn't think of it. And he told me the name without the knowledge of him being the gaslighter in our relationship. And there was also a financial abuse. Like, he didn't want to grow up. I was ready to grow up and you do grown up things, and he just really didn't. And so he didn't have a job that paid enough to support both of our, to pay his fair share. So I was doing a lot of the financial load. I was doing the emotional load. I was doing all the cleaning. Like, I was doing all the things. And it was just this really unhealthy codependent relationship. And I reached a point where I was like, I know that I am not doing something right. I had decided that I needed to do something differently, because I kept repeating the same mistake and expecting a different outcome. And so, yes, it was a really unhealthy relationship. There was a lot of stuff on his end that just was unhealthy and not acceptable. But I had to look at myself and go, you're the common denominator in this. You're the common denominator in your problems. So what can you do differently? And so when I found a really good therapist, and she taught me about boundaries, she told me what intimacy is, which I want to kind of sidetrack a little bit here, because when we think about intimacy in our society, we really think about sex. And I say that, and I want you to think about the idea that sex does not have to be intimate. Just think about that for a couple of seconds. But intimacy can be sex, but it can be so many other things. You can have intimacy with friends. You can have intimacy with your romantic partner. You can have intimacy with your children. You can have intimacy with anyone you're close to. And so when we're talking about intimacy, it's really that trust and that vulnerability that you can have with someone. And there was none of that with him. And she also told me about negative self-talk. She asked me one day, she was like, how do you talk to yourself? Is it negative? And I was like, oh, yeah, it is. Like, most of it's negative. And you don't realize, when you're somebody who deals with a lot of negative self-talk, that, one, you're doing it because, like, you're the only one in your head. Nobody's there to check you and be like, hey, that's not right. And so really understanding, like, having her help me give myself permission to have boundaries with him and some family members, and understanding that, I had choices in these relationships, and I got to say yes and no, and I needed that to be honored. really went a long way. And it helped me break that cycle with him. And so I want to bring that back to the clarity catalyst in this first part and tell you it's an 8-week program. Each week we talk about a different aspect of what's really emotional intelligence. This course was started by a professor at Stanford. He saw all these people coming out of the MBA program there. And I mean, like these are white men, right? They're just graduated from Ivy League school. They have an MBA. Like the world is their oyster. They should have just this amazing life and be completely fulfilled and happy and just go out into the world and rock it. And they weren't. And he really started looking at these people and going, well, what's missing? And what is in the clarity catalyst is what he found was missing for these people. And everything is still taught there. Everybody loves it. And so in the first couple of weeks, we talk about creative thinking. And I want you to kind of change your definition of creative for a second. If you think of like crafty, dancers, artists, these people, like, yes, they're creative, but creative thinking is something that we're all capable of, but we're kind of get that beaten out of us as we're adults, or, as we're growing up and, people tell us, oh, you're not creative or you're not a good artist. So, go do this thing. But creative thinking really comes down to being able to step back and go, what can I do differently? What are my options that I'm not seeing? And how can I show up differently? And that's what the work that I did with my therapist allowed me to do. And then also the negative self-talk. So this is one of my favorite sessions. In the second week, we identify our gremlins. It's like our suffering mind persona that is in there telling us our negative thoughts. And so we personify these and make posters and put them up and identify them so that we can talk to them and bring them back down. And then later on in the course, we talk one week about intuition. And as women, especially, I feel like we are taught to ignore our intuition from an early age, especially if we grow up in a family that doesn't have good boundaries. We're a lot of times ignoring what our gut is telling us is the right thing for us, but we're not allowed to do it as children. And then we go out into the world and we carry that with us. And so those were some of the things that I got out of the work that I had kind of unknowingly been doing. And then I took the Clarity Catalyst as a student and realized, oh, I've done a lot of this work. This stuff is amazing. It does work. Like it leads to, for me, it led to healthy relationships with people, more confidence in myself, confidence in setting boundaries and sticking to them and understanding what my boundaries were. And so I'm going to go on to part 2 and tell you what happened after I went through this experience and broke up with the guy. Because I will tell you, I did want to have a healthy relationship. I just didn't know how. And so join me in part 2 for how I met my dream guy and what that's been like.